The night before my wedding, my sister stood at the rehearsal dinner with a champagne flute in one hand and a folded piece of cream cardstock in the other, and she told 43 people that I had stolen the only man who had ever loved her. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was 31 years old. I was marrying a man named Thomas Ashford, who had never met my sister before we got engaged. And the microphone clipped to the lapel of the band's sound engineer had been recording for 27 minutes by the time she reached the word stolen. She didn't know that. She didn't know a lot of things. She didn't know that the maid-of-honor speech she had replaced with her own version had been written by me 6 weeks earlier and printed on the exact same cream cardstock my mother had bought in a bulk pack from a stationery store in Charleston. She didn't know that the sound engineer, a quiet man named Reuben who had been hired by the venue for the rehearsal and the wedding both, had started his recording early because the bride's father had asked him to capture the entire evening as a gift. She didn't know that my grandmother, 84 years old and sharp as a paring knife, was sitting 3 tables away with her hearing aid turned up to its maximum setting. She also didn't know that at 11:47 that same night, after every guest had gone home and my mother had finished apologizing to Thomas's parents with the kind of tight, bright voice she reserved for damage control, I would be sitting in the bridal suite at the Magnolia Hill Inn with a legal pad in my lap, writing down every sentence my sister had said. Every one. In order. Because I had been a federal prosecutor's paralegal for 7 years, and I knew exactly what a transcript looked like when you needed one to hold up in a room full of witnesses. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back 6 weeks. Let me take you back to the Saturday my sister Claire called me from the kitchen of the house we had both grown up in and asked, in the voice she used when she wanted something, whether I had finalized the wedding party yet. Before I do, hit the like button if family stories like this one pull you in, and tap subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you I notice where you're tuning in from. Claire was 29. She was the younger sister by 2 years. She had been, for all of her life, the daughter my mother pointed to when people asked how the girls were doing. The one with the laugh you could hear across a restaurant. The one who had been homecoming queen, prom queen, and, for 3 semesters at the University of Georgia, the social chair of a sorority I had never pledged because I had been too busy working 30 hours a week at a law library to afford my own textbooks. Claire had graduated with a degree in public relations and a fiancé named Marcus. Marcus had ended the engagement in the spring of 2023, 4 months before the wedding, with a letter he sent in the mail because he didn't want to say the words out loud. Claire had moved back into our parents' house. She had been there ever since. I had not moved back into our parents' house. I had gone to law school at night while working full-time at the paralegal office. I had paid for my own apartment, my own car, my own groceries, my own health insurance. I had, in my mother's words, always been the sensible one, which in my family meant the one whose feelings did not need to be consulted before the family made decisions about her life. Thomas and I had been together for 3 years when he proposed on a Sunday morning in November with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I had said yes before he finished the sentence. My mother had cried on the phone when I told her. Claire had sent a text that said, "Congrats, sis. Happy for you." 6 weeks before the wedding, Claire called me on a Saturday afternoon. I was sorting through boxes in the spare bedroom of the apartment Thomas and I had just started sharing. The phone rang and I answered on speaker because my hands were full of framed photographs. She said, "Have you finalized the wedding party yet?" I said, "Mostly." "Why?" She said, "Mom and I were talking, and we think it would be really meaningful if I was the maid of honor." I set the photograph down. I said, "Claire, I already asked Priya." Priya was my best friend from law school. She had flown in from San Francisco twice during our engagement to help me dress shop. She had said yes before I finished the sentence. She had already booked her flight. Claire said, "Oh. Well, can't she just be a bridesmaid?" "I'm your sister, Elle. It would look weird if I wasn't the maid of honor." I did not say anything for 4 seconds. Claire took the silence as encouragement. She said, Mom already told Aunt Diane I was doing it. And Grandma Ruth. I'd have to call everyone and explain. I said, Claire, I'm not changing my wedding party because Mom told people something that wasn't true. She said, don't make this into a thing. You know Mom. She gets excited. Just let me be the maid of honor. Priya can be a bridesmaid. She'll understand. She's your friend, right? I said, I'll think about it. I hung up. I did not think about it. I called my mother. My mother did what my mother always did when I caught her in a lie. She acted hurt. She said, Eleanor, you know how Claire has been since Marcus. She needs something. She needs to feel included. Can't you give your sister this one thing? I said, Mom, I'm giving her a seat at the head table. I'm giving her a place in the wedding party. I'm not giving her a role I already promised to someone else. My mother said, You've always been so rigid, I said, Mom, I have to go. I hung up on her too. Thomas came home 2 hours later and found me at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a legal pad. He said, What happened? I told him. He said, What are you going to do? I said, Nothing. Priya is the maid of honor. Claire is a bridesmaid. That's the end of it. Thomas said, Okay. And your mother? I said, My mother will be fine once she realizes I'm not going to change my mind. Thomas, who had met my mother exactly 4 times and had already understood her better than she understood herself, did not argue with me. He just poured himself a glass of wine and sat down across from me and said, Eleanor, I love you, but I think you need to assume your sister is going to try something. I said, She wouldn't. He said, I didn't say she would succeed. I said she would try. I remembered that sentence 2 weeks later when my mother called to tell me Claire had offered to write a toast for the rehearsal dinner. I remembered it 3 weeks later when my mother called to tell me Claire had offered to help with the seating chart. I remembered it 4 weeks later when Claire texted me to ask what color the cream cardstock was that my mother had bought for the name cards. I told her. I told her the name of the stationery store. I told her the brand. I did not think about why she was asking. I should have. The rehearsal dinner was at the Magnolia Hill Inn in Beaufort, South Carolina. My parents had chosen it because my mother had always wanted a daughter's wedding at the Magnolia Hill Inn. It had a long porch wrapped in white railings, a lawn that sloped down to a tidal creek, and a dining room with 12 windows that opened onto the water. Thomas's parents had flown in from Connecticut the day before. My grandmother had driven down from Charleston with her best friend, a woman named Vivian who had known our family since 1962. Priya had arrived the morning of the rehearsal with a garment bag and a bottle of champagne and a speech she had written and rehearsed and rewritten for 3 months. The rehearsal itself went smoothly. We walked through the ceremony at 4 o'clock. Thomas held my hand through the vows. The officiant, a retired judge named Martin Brennan, told us we were going to be just fine. Claire stood with the bridesmaids in her pale green dress and smiled at everything and hugged my mother twice. At 5:30, we walked across the lawn to the dining room for the rehearsal dinner. At 6 o'clock, 43 people sat down to eat. The sound engineer, Ruben, was setting up in the corner. My father had hired him for both nights because my father had a habit of hiring people to document things, which was how my father showed love. Ruben clipped a microphone to the lapel of his own jacket and another to a stand near the head table. He tested his levels. He pressed record at 6:43. He would tell me the exact time later, when it mattered. Dinner was 3 courses. Thomas's father gave a short, warm toast about how he had known Thomas was going to marry me the first time he saw Thomas look at me across a dinner table. My grandmother stood up without a glass and told a story about my grandfather, who had died in 2019, and the way he had always said the Whitmore women were the most stubborn women in South Carolina and that was the highest compliment he could give. Everyone laughed. My mother cried a little, the way she cried for an audience. My father kissed her on the temple. It was, for 27 minutes of recorded audio, a beautiful evening. And then Claire stood up. She had not asked to give a toast. I had not put her on the list. Priya was the one scheduled to speak at the rehearsal dinner, and Priya's speech, which she had been rehearsing in the hotel mirror for 2 hours that afternoon, was written on 3 small index cards in her purse. Claire stood up with a champagne flute in her left hand and a folded piece of cream cardstock in her right, and she tapped her fork against her glass, and she said, "Before Priya speaks, I wanted to say something as Eleanor's sister." She smiled at the room. She smiled at me. I felt Thomas's hand tighten on my thigh under the table. Priya, across the room, looked at me with her eyebrows raised. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. I did not want to make a scene at my own rehearsal dinner. I thought, naively, that Claire was going to say something sisterly and sentimental, that she was going to take the moment for herself, that she was going to be the center of attention for 3 minutes and then sit down and the evening would continue. I thought the worst thing that could happen was that Claire would cry a little and talk about herself instead of me, which was what Claire always did, and which I had made peace with a long time ago. Claire unfolded the cream cardstock. She cleared her throat. She began to read. "Eleanor and I grew up in the same house," she said. "We had the same parents. We went to the same schools. And for a long time, we even had the same dreams. I'm the younger sister. I'm the one who always looked up to her. I'm the one who always wanted to be like her." A few people nodded. My mother smiled encouragingly. Thomas's mother, across the table, was watching Claire with the careful, polite attention of a woman who did not know my sister but was willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Claire took a breath. She said, "What most of you don't know is that Eleanor and I once loved the same man." The room did not change yet. Most of the people at the table thought she was being dramatic. My mother's smile flickered for the first time. I felt the blood leave my face. Claire said, "His name was Marcus. He and I were engaged. We were planning a wedding. And 4 months before our wedding, he called it off. He said he needed space. He said he had fallen for someone else. He didn't tell me who it was at the time. He told me later." She looked at me. She held my gaze. She said, "Eleanor, I know you didn't mean to. I know these things happen. I forgave you a long time ago. I just wanted everyone here tonight to understand how much it means to me that I'm standing here as your sister, and that I've found a way to love you through everything that happened. I've learned that family is bigger than any man. And Thomas, I hope you treat her better than Marcus did. I hope you know what you're getting." She raised her glass. She said, "To Eleanor, who always gets what she wants." She drank. Nobody else drank. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room full of people who have just been told a story they don't know how to respond to. Thomas's mother was staring at her plate. Thomas's father had put his hand on his wife's back. My father had turned the color of skim milk. My mother's mouth was slightly open. My grandmother, 3 tables away, had her hearing aid turned up to its maximum setting, and she was looking at Claire the way a hawk looks at a rabbit. I did not stand up. I did not cry. I did not respond. I had spent 7 years reading depositions for a living, and I knew what happened to people who reacted to a lie before they had the full picture. I felt Thomas's hand still on my thigh, steady. I felt Priya's eyes on me from across the room. I felt Ruben's microphone, which I had not yet remembered existed, picking up every sound in the room, including the sound of Claire setting her champagne flute down too hard on the linen tablecloth. I had never dated Marcus. I had met Marcus exactly 4 times. The first time was at a 4th of July cookout at my parents' house in 2022. The second time was at Christmas dinner that same year. The third time was at Claire's engagement party in January of 2023. The fourth time was at my grandmother's birthday lunch in March of 2023, which was the last time I saw him before he ended the engagement in April. I had never been alone in a room with him. I had never had his phone number. I had never texted him. I had never done anything that could possibly be interpreted, by any reasonable person, as taking him from my sister. The story she had just told 43 people, including my fiancé's parents, including my grandmother, including Priya, including a retired judge, was not a story. It was a fiction. And she had written it down on cream cardstock and rehearsed it and delivered it at my rehearsal dinner, 48 hours before my wedding. I did not know yet that she had also replaced Priya's maid-of-honor speech. I did not know yet that she had reached into Priya's purse during cocktails, pulled out the 3 index cards, and slipped in a folded piece of the same cream cardstock with Priya's name typed at the top and a similar story printed below in the same font. I did not know yet that Priya was going to pull that cardstock out of her purse in 20 minutes, look at it, and realize what she was holding. I did not know yet that my grandmother, without looking at anyone, was going to reach into her own purse and pull out a small leather notebook and begin writing down the time, the date, and the exact words my sister had just spoken. I did not know yet that Reuben was going to come find me at the end of the night and ask, very quietly, whether I wanted a copy of the audio. I did not know any of it yet. I only knew that my sister had just lit a match at my rehearsal dinner and that the match was already burning. What I did know, sitting in that chair with my fiancé's hand on my thigh and my napkin folded in my lap, was something my grandmother had told me when I was 9 years old and had come home from school crying because a girl named Jessie had told the whole 4th grade that my mother drank in the mornings. Grandma Ruth had sat me down at her kitchen table and poured me a glass of iced tea and said, "Eleanor, people who tell lies about you in public usually don't have a plan for what happens when the truth shows up. You don't have to chase them. You just have to let the truth walk in the door on its own time. And when it walks in, you make sure you're the one holding the door." I did not chase Claire that night. I did not stand up and denounce her. I did not call her a liar in front of 43 people. I sat in my chair, and I watched her finish her drink, and I watched my mother try to laugh and pivot the conversation back to something light, and I watched Priya stand up and give a short, gracious, completely extemporaneous toast that did not mention any of what had just happened. And then, when the rehearsal dinner ended, I walked upstairs to the bridal suite at the Magnolia Hill Inn with Thomas beside me, and I took off my shoes, and I sat down on the bed, and I took out a yellow legal pad, and I started writing. Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed beside me. He did not ask me if I was okay. He knew I was not okay. He asked instead what he could do. I said, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about what she said. Word for word. Starting from when she stood up." He did. He had a good memory. He had been a structural engineer for 9 years, and he had the kind of brain that held sentences the way other people held phone numbers. I wrote down every line he gave me. Then I cross-referenced it with what I had heard myself. Then I sat with the legal pad in my lap for a long time. There was a knock at the door at 11:52. Priya. She came in with her shoes in her hand and her hair already halfway out of its pins. She did not say anything at first. She walked to the dresser, set her shoes down, and pulled a piece of cream cardstock from her purse. She held it up. She said, "Elle, I need you to look at this." I took it. The top of the card said Priya Krishnan, maid of honor. The text below was 3 short paragraphs. The first paragraph introduced Priya as Eleanor's best friend from law school. The second paragraph said that Priya had watched Eleanor grow into a woman who knew what she wanted and went after it, no matter who was standing in the way. The third paragraph said that Priya hoped Thomas understood he was marrying a woman who had always been willing to take what she wanted, and that he should consider himself warned. I read it twice. Priya said, "That is not what I wrote. I wrote something else. It's gone. This was in my purse in its place." Thomas said, "When did you last look at your purse?" Priya said, "I had it at cocktails. I set it on the chair next to the bar. I was talking to your grandmother for maybe 10 minutes. I said, "Who else was at the bar?" Priya said, "Claire was. I remember because she brought me a drink." I said, "Was your purse open?" Priya said, "The top was unzipped. I had taken my phone out to show your grandmother a picture." I sat very still. Thomas said, "So she swapped the speech." Priya said, "She swapped the speech." And if I had stood up and read that without looking at it first, I would have accused Eleanor of taking Marcus in front of 43 people. As her maid of honor. I said, that's why she went first. Priya said, what? I said, she gave her toast first. She wasn't on the program. She stood up before you could. If you had gone first, you would have read that card, realized what it said, and either refused to read it or read it and destroyed my wedding. She didn't want to take the risk. She wanted to set the table herself, so that when you stood up with the same story, the room would already believe it. She wanted two voices saying the same lie. Priya sat down on the bed beside me. She said, Eleanor. She's been planning this for weeks. Thomas said, she asked you about the cardstock, didn't she? I said, a month ago. I told her where my mother bought it. I told her the brand. Thomas said, so she bought the same stock. She printed a version that looked like Priya's. And when Priya stood up to give her real speech, she would have pulled out what she thought was her own card and read Claire's lie instead. Priya said, I always read the top line before I start. Always. I would have caught it. I would have refused. But the room would have watched me refuse, and Claire would have stood up a second time and said, see, even her best friend knows. I wrote that down too. I wrote it in capital letters. Plan A, read as Priya. Plan B, read as Claire if Priya hesitates. I said, she had two versions of the same lie ready to deliver. If Priya had read it, the room would have heard it from a neutral party. If Priya refused, Claire would have taken the microphone herself and said it was true anyway. Either way, the story gets told. There was a second knock at the door at 12:14. Reuben. He had his soundboard under one arm and a small laptop under the other. He said, Miss Whitmore, I apologize for disturbing you on the night before your wedding. I would not be here if I did not think this was important. I have the audio from the rehearsal dinner. All of it. Your father asked me to capture the evening as a gift for your parents' anniversary scrapbook. I started my recording at 6:43. I did not stop it. Your sister's statement is on it. In full. Clean audio. The second microphone on the stand near your head table picked up her words at broadcast quality. I wanted to ask you if you wanted me to preserve the file or delete it. I looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at me. Priya said, very quietly, I said, Reuben, could you preserve it? In fact, could you make me 3 copies? One on a USB drive. One emailed to my personal address. One emailed to a man named David Caldwell at this email address. I wrote the address on a hotel notepad. Caldwell was not Caldwell from any other story. Caldwell was the senior partner at the firm where I had worked for 7 years. He had been my mentor since I was 24. He was in Charleston, 2 hours away. He was coming to the wedding tomorrow with his wife. I said, flag the email urgent. He'll see it tonight. Reuben nodded once. He said, Miss Whitmore, I've been doing this for 22 years. I've worked 300 weddings. I have never volunteered a recording to a bride before. I'm volunteering this one because I have 2 sisters, and I would want to know. I thanked him. He left. I sat on the bed with my legal pad and Priya's cream cardstock and the ghost of Reuben's email sitting in my sent folder. Thomas said, what do you want to do? I said, I'm going to get married tomorrow. I'm going to walk down the aisle with my father. I'm going to say my vows. I'm going to cut the cake. And then, during the reception, at the moment my sister thinks she has won, I'm going to let the room hear what she actually said tonight. Not me. The room. Her own voice, coming out of Reuben's sound system, at her volume, in her words, with 43 of the same witnesses in the room. Priya said, Eleanor. Are you sure? I said, I'm sure. Thomas said, what about your mother? I said, my mother helped her. Maybe not with the cards. But with the shape of it. My mother has been telling Claire since Marcus left that I took something from her. I've heard it in how she talks to me. I've heard it and how she talks about me. Tomorrow, my mother is going to find out what it costs to build a story like that. Priya stayed until 1:30. We drafted a short statement together, 3 paragraphs long, which I intended to read at the reception after the audio played. It was calm. It was factual. It did not accuse. It simply told the truth, in my own voice, with my own timeline. I signed the bottom of the page the way I signed legal documents at work. Eleanor R. Whitmore. Then I slept. I slept for 4 hours. I did not dream. I woke up at 6. I drank coffee. I put on my dress. I walked down the aisle at 11 in the morning on a Saturday in October under a sky the color of new paper, and I married Thomas Ashford in front of 132 people, and my sister Claire stood 3 feet behind me in a pale green dress and smiled the whole time. If this story is pulling you in, if you have ever sat in a room and listened to someone tell a lie about you in front of people you loved, please take 1 second right now and subscribe. Turn notifications on so you don't miss the next one. Your support is the reason I keep telling these stories, and I read every comment. Back to the wedding. The ceremony ended at 11:40. The receiving line ran until 12:15. Cocktail hour began in the garden at 12:30. The reception moved indoors at 1:30 for lunch and the toasts. The band set up at the far end of the ballroom. Reuben was in the corner. He caught my eye once as I walked past him on my way to the head table. He gave me the smallest nod. The USB drive was in his shirt pocket. The file was loaded on his laptop. He had tested the audio 3 times that morning. Claire was seated at the head table on my right. My mother had arranged the seating chart. Claire had asked for that seat specifically. She had been planning on giving the maid-of-honor toast. She did not know that I had moved her off the toast list at 6 in the morning and texted the band to remove her name from the program. December of 2022 at Christmas dinner at my parents' house. January of 2023 at Claire's engagement party, which I attended as a guest. March of 2023 at my grandmother's 82nd birthday lunch, which my grandmother is happy to confirm. That is every time I have ever been in the same room as Marcus Beaumont. I was never alone with him. I never had his phone number. I never texted him, called him, or emailed him. I have documentary evidence of every one of those statements, including phone records that my law firm pulled for me this morning on my authorization as a client. The phone records cover the entire period from the day I met Marcus to the day he ended his engagement to my sister. They show 0 contact. Not 1 call. Not 1 text. Not 1 email. Nothing. I paused. I let the room sit with it. I said, Marcus Beaumont ended his engagement to Claire on April the 11th, 2023, in a letter he mailed to her parents' house. I did not know him. He did not know me well enough to leave her for me. The story my sister told last night is not a version of events. It is an invention. And I would not be standing here in my wedding dress on the day of my wedding speaking about it, except that she chose to tell that invention in front of 43 people including my husband's parents, and she chose to do it 48 hours before my wedding, which means she chose to do it specifically so that the story would be in the room when I walked down the aisle today. I looked at Claire. I said, Claire, I am going to give you 1 chance to speak. You can stand up now and apologize in front of these people, and we can begin to repair what you did. Or you can sit there. Those are the 2 options. I am not going to ask you twice. Claire did not stand up. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. She said, in a voice so small I almost did not hear it, I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I said, Claire. You wrote it down on cardstock. You rehearsed it. You replaced Priya's maid-of-honor speech with a version of the same story under her name. Priya has the card in her purse. I have the recording. My grandmother was taking notes last night in her little leather notebook. She has the notebook with her today. You meant every word the way it sounded. You meant it for 43 people at the rehearsal dinner. You meant for Priya to read a version of it today, in front of 132 people, so that I could not contradict my own maid of honor. You meant for the story to be in the room when I said my vows. You meant for Thomas's parents to hear it. You meant for my grandmother to hear it. And I want to know, in front of all of these people, why? Claire stood up. She did not stand up to apologize. She stood up because she could not stay seated under the weight of the room. She said, "You think you're better than all of us. You always have." I said, "That isn't an answer to my question." She said, "You had the grades. You had the law school. You had Thomas. You had everything I was supposed to have, and you never once noticed that I was drowning." I said, "Claire, I love you. And none of what you just said gives you the right to lie about me in front of my husband's family." She said, "Marcus left because of you." I said, "Marcus left because of something you did, and we both know what it was, and I have never, once, in 3 years, told a single person in this family what it was." "Sit down, Claire. Please. Sit down." She did not sit down. My mother stood up instead. My mother said, "Eleanor, this is enough. You are making a scene at your own wedding." I looked at my mother. I said, "Mom. I love you. And if you say one more word in defense of what she did, I am going to tell this room what you said to me on the phone 6 weeks ago when I told you Priya was the maid of honor. I have that phone call too. I record calls with family members for my own protection. It is legal in South Carolina with one-party consent. I am a paralegal. I know the law. Sit down." My mother sat down. She sat down the way a person sits down when the floor has gone out from under them. My grandmother stood up. 84 years old, in a dove-gray dress, with her leather notebook in her hand. The room turned to her the way a room turns to a judge. She said, "Eleanor, may I?" I said, "Grandma, please." She walked to the front of the room slowly, because her knee was not what it used to be, and she stood beside me at the microphone. She said, "I am Ruth Whitmore. I am Eleanor's grandmother. I was at the rehearsal dinner last night. I was at my granddaughter's engagement party in 2023. I was at every one of the 4 occasions Eleanor just described. I have known Marcus Beaumont in passing. I have known Claire all her life. I have known Eleanor all her life. And I have known, for 12 months, why Marcus Beaumont ended his engagement to Claire. I have kept that knowledge to myself because I believed it was not my story to tell. It is still not my story to tell. But I am here today to tell this room one sentence, so that none of you ever have to wonder whether the story you just heard on that recording has any truth in it at all. The sentence is this. Eleanor had nothing to do with the end of that engagement. Nothing. I would swear to it in any court in this country. I am swearing to it now in a room full of witnesses at my granddaughter's wedding. She closed her notebook. She walked back to her table. Vivian reached up and took her hand. Claire was crying now. Not performatively. Actually crying. Her shoulders were shaking. My father had not moved from his plate. Thomas's mother had walked over to Thomas's father and was standing behind his chair with one hand on his shoulder. Caldwell at his table was watching me with the face he wore in courtrooms, which was the face of a man who was not surprised by anything he was seeing. I said, "I am not going to prosecute this any further today. I have said what needed to be said. I have shown what needed to be shown. My grandmother has said the only other sentence that needed saying. Claire, you are still my sister. I am not going to throw you out of my wedding. But I want you to understand something. Every person in this room now knows what you did. Every person in this room will remember it. You built this moment yourself. I did not build it for you." I picked up my legal pad. I stepped back from the microphone. I walked to my seat. I sat down beside Thomas. Thomas put his hand over mine. Annika, the band leader, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped to the microphone and said, in the professional voice of a woman who had worked 300 weddings and knew exactly what was needed. "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner service will resume in a moment. Please enjoy your meal." The room exhaled. The waiters moved. The plates came out. Life in the ballroom continued, because life always continues, even after a room has watched something it will never forget. Claire left the reception at 3:15. My mother left with her. My father stayed. He stayed through the cake. He stayed through the first dance. At 5 o'clock, he came to my table with his eyes wet and he said, "Eleanor, I didn't know. I want you to know that I didn't know." I said, "Dad, I believe you. But you have lived in that house for 35 years, and you have watched how Mom talks about me, and you have not said anything, and that is going to be a separate conversation between you and me, on another day, when I am ready to have it." He nodded. He said, "Whenever you're ready, Peanut." He had not called me Peanut since I was 12. I let him hug me. I did not hug him back with my whole body. Not yet. Some hugs have to be earned back over time. Caldwell found me at 6. He kissed my cheek. He said, "Eleanor, that was the cleanest cross-examination I have seen in 20 years. And you did it in a wedding dress." I laughed. I laughed hard enough that Thomas turned to look at me. Caldwell said, "You have a job at my firm for the rest of your life if you want it. I've been telling you for 3 years to take the LSAT. I am telling you again tonight. Take it." I said, "David, I'll think about it." He said, "Take it." Then he and his wife went back to their table, and Thomas took my hand, and we walked out onto the dance floor, and the band played a song we had picked together on a Tuesday night in June, and I danced with my husband in a wedding dress that had cost more than my first car, and I did not think about my sister for the length of the song. The fallout came in pieces over the next 3 months. My mother did not speak to me for 11 weeks. When she finally called, it was to tell me that Claire had moved out of the house and was staying with a cousin in Savannah, and that my mother believed I owed Claire an apology for humiliating her in public. I told my mother, calmly, that I loved her, and that I was not going to have that conversation with her, and that if she wanted to rebuild a relationship with me she was going to have to start by acknowledging what she had allowed. She hung up. She called back 2 weeks later. She did not acknowledge anything, but she asked if Thomas and I wanted to come for Sunday dinner. I said no. I said maybe in a few months. I said I loved her. I meant all 3 sentences. Claire sent me a letter in February. It was 4 pages long, handwritten. She did not apologize in the first 3 pages. She apologized in the 4th. The apology was careful and real. She wrote that she had spent 4 years telling herself a story about me because the story about herself was too hard to carry. She wrote that she had known, the entire time she was writing the cardstock, that what she was writing was not true. She wrote that she had done it anyway because she could not stand the thought of watching me get married while she was still living in our parents' house. She asked for nothing in the letter. She did not ask to be forgiven. She did not ask to be in my life. She said only that she wanted me to know that she knew what she had done. I read the letter twice. I put it in a box with my other important papers. I did not write back. Not yet. I may, someday. I have not decided. Thomas's parents sent me a note in December. Thomas's mother had written it. It said, "Eleanor, we have a daughter-in-law we are proud of. We saw who you are at your wedding. We saw who your grandmother is. We saw who your father tried to be. We are glad our son chose you." I still have the note. It is in the same box as Claire's letter. Different corners of the box. Different weights. Priya came back for Thanksgiving. She and her husband flew in from San Francisco. We cooked a turkey in our small kitchen. Grandma Ruth drove up from Charleston. Vivian came with her. Thomas's parents joined us for dessert. My father came. My mother did not. Claire did not. The table was full anyway. My grandmother said grace. She said, Lord, thank you for the ones at this table. Thank you for the ones who are not. Thank you for the truth, which is always slower than the lie but always heavier once it arrives. Amen. We ate. I think about that wedding day more than I thought I would. Not the confrontation. Not the audio. Not even the moment my grandmother stood up beside me at the microphone. I think about the moment, about an hour later, when I was standing by myself on the porch of the Magnolia Hill Inn in my wedding dress, watching the sun go down over the tidal creek, and Reuben came out to find me. He had a cardboard box in his hand. He said, Miss Whitmore. I mean Mrs. Ashford. I have the master audio file here, and the backups, and every recording from both nights. I am giving them all to you. I'm not keeping copies. This belongs to you. I said, Reuben. Thank you. He said, Mrs. Ashford. May I tell you something? I said, please. He said, I have been watching weddings for 22 years. I know what a family looks like when it is healthy. Yours isn't, yet. But you are. And your grandmother is. And your husband is. You are going to build something new with the three of you, and the people you choose to invite into it. The family you were born into will either join that thing or it won't. That is not your job to force. Then he handed me the box and he walked back inside. I stood on the porch for a long time after that. I watched the sun go down. I did not cry. I felt, for the first time in a long time, very quiet inside. Not the quiet of holding something back. The quiet of having put something down. I am 24 now. I have been married for just under a year. I am in my first semester of law school at night, on Caldwell's firm's dime, while working full-time during the day. Thomas cooks dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I cook on the other nights. Prudence, the golden retriever we adopted in March, sleeps at the foot of the bed and snores louder than any dog has a right to. My grandmother comes for Sunday lunch once a month. My father comes every other Sunday. My mother has come twice in 11 months. Claire has not come. We are not there yet. We may never be. I have made peace with the shape of that sentence. Here's the one thing I learned, and I will say it once and then I will stop. A person who builds a story about you in the dark assumes nobody will ever turn on the light. The light does not have to be loud. The light does not have to be cruel. The light can be a sound engineer with a recording. The light can be a grandmother with a leather notebook. The light can be a best friend who always reads the top line of a card before she starts. The light can be a husband whose hand on your thigh under a table steadies you when your voice cannot. The light, in the end, is just the truth, walking slowly through the door you already left open. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. She had figured out something was wrong by the time she arrived at the venue, because Priya was already wearing the maid-of-honor sash that Claire had expected to take. My mother had pulled me aside during the receiving line and hissed, Eleanor, what is going on? Claire was supposed to speak. I had smiled at her, hugged the next guest in line, and said, Mom, we'll talk later. My mother had stood very still for a moment, and then she had gone to find Claire, and the two of them had spent the cocktail hour on the far side of the garden talking in low voices. At 1:45, my father stood up to welcome the room. He spoke for 3 minutes. He said the kind of thing fathers say at weddings, which is to say he said nothing very much and said it with love. He sat down. Thomas's father stood up next. He spoke for 4 minutes. He was warmer than he had been the night before. He was a man who had slept on what he had heard at the rehearsal dinner, and he had made a decision about who he believed. He finished his toast by lifting his glass to me and saying, to Eleanor, the finest young woman my son could have possibly chosen, and the daughter my wife and I are proud to welcome into our family. The room drank. Claire drank too, because she had to, but she set her glass down quickly. Priya stood up at 1:52. She had her real speech in her hand, the one she had rewritten that morning at the breakfast table with me. She spoke for 6 minutes. She told the story of the first time she had met me at the law library, of the way I had stayed up until 3 in the morning helping her understand a contracts question that wasn't even in my section. She told the story of how I had driven her to the airport at 4 in the morning when her father had a heart attack in 2019, and how I had stayed on the phone with her the entire flight. She said, "Eleanor is the most careful friend I have ever had. She notices things. She remembers things. She protects the people she loves. Thomas, you have married a woman who will walk into fire for you. All you have to do is deserve her." Which, for the record, you do. The room applauded. Claire clapped politely. My mother wiped an eye with a napkin. Then I stood up. I was not on the program. I had told the band at 6 that morning that I wanted the microphone after Priya. The band leader had looked at me, a young woman named Annika with a calm face, and she had said, "Whatever you need, Mrs. Ashford." I had left for the first time that morning at the sound of the name. I walked to the microphone in my wedding dress with my legal pad folded into quarters in my hand. I did not shake. I had stopped shaking at 1:30 that morning, the moment I had decided what I was going to do. I set the legal pad on the podium. I looked out at the room. 132 people. My grandmother 3 tables back with her hand on Vivian's wrist. Thomas's parents. Caldwell at a table near the window, his wife next to him, his face already careful. My father. My mother. Claire. I said, "Thank you all for coming. Before I say anything else, I want to thank my husband for marrying me today. I want to thank my father for walking me down the aisle. I want to thank my grandmother, Ruth Whitmore, for being the woman I have always wanted to be." My grandmother nodded once. I said, I had not planned to speak at my own reception. Brides don't usually. But something happened last night at our rehearsal dinner that I feel I have to address, because it was said in front of many of the people in this room, and silence in the face of a false accusation is the same as agreement. And I am not going to agree to it. The room went very still. Claire's glass was halfway to her mouth. She set it down. My mother's face went white. I said, last night, at the rehearsal dinner, my sister Claire stood up and told 43 people that I was responsible for the end of her engagement to a man named Marcus Beaumont. She told the room that Marcus and I had, in her words, loved each other, and that I had been the reason he ended the engagement in April of 2023. She did not use the word affair, but she implied it. She said the words, and I am quoting her exactly, "Eleanor and I once loved the same man." She said, and again I am quoting her, "Thomas, I hope you treat her better than Marcus did." She said, and this is the line that has stayed with me, "To Eleanor, who always gets what she wants." The room did not move. Claire's face was the color of wet paper. I said, I want to be very clear about what I am about to do, because I know how it will look. I am not going to stand here and call my sister a liar. I do not have to. I have something better than my word against hers. Thanks to a very kind sound engineer who recorded the rehearsal dinner as a gift for my father's anniversary album, I have the audio. Every word. At broadcast quality. I am going to ask the engineer to play 45 seconds of it, so that you do not have to take my word for what was said. You can hear it yourselves. And then I am going to explain what actually happened in 2023, with dates and with witnesses, and I am going to ask Claire, in front of all of you, to tell us which version of events is the true one. I looked at Ruben. He was already at his laptop. He pressed play. Claire's voice filled the ballroom. Crisp. Clear. Every word. Eleanor and I once loved the same man. His name was Marcus. He and I were engaged. We were planning a wedding. And 4 months before our wedding, he called it off. He said he needed space. He said he had fallen for someone else. He didn't tell me who it was at the time. He told me later. A pause. Eleanor, I know you didn't mean to. I know these things happen. I forgave you a long time ago. The audio stopped. Reuben had cut it at exactly the line I had asked him to cut it at. 45 seconds. Long enough for every guest who had not been there the night before to understand, at full volume, what had been said. The silence that followed was not a silence. It was a sound. It was the sound of 132 people holding a single shared breath. My mother had put both hands flat on the table. My father was staring at his plate. Claire was not moving. Thomas's mother, who had been at the rehearsal dinner, had turned to Thomas's father and said something I could not hear, and Thomas's father had nodded once. I said, I met Marcus Beaumont 4 times. July of 2022 at my parents' 4th of July cookout.